They tell you the great flood washed the earth clean. They tell you it wiped away all the sin, all the corruption, all the mistakes of the ancient world. They lied. You can drown a giant's body. You can crush flesh and bone under billions of tons of water. You can level entire mountain ranges. You can erase every trace of a civilization from the surface of the earth. But you cannot drown a spirit. Tonight, we open a text they tried to bury, the Book of Enoch. And we are going to uncover the darkest, most terrifying secret that was carefully, deliberately removed from your Bible. Not a secret about how the ancient world ended. A secret about what survived the water. Because what if the flood was never a punishment? What if it was a desperate, last resort quarantine protocol issued from heaven itself? What if the target was not human sin but a biological contamination so severe, so irreversible, that the only solution was planetary amputation? And what if it failed? What if the creatures that terrified the ancient world, the monsters, the giants, the things that made armies turn and run, didn't die in the flood? What if they simply lost their physical bodies? And what if they are still here? Still walking? Still hungry? Still looking for a way back in? We have been taught to fear hell, to fear fallen angels locked in chains in some distant abyss. But the Book of Enoch says we are looking in entirely the wrong direction. The threat is not beneath the earth. It is not in another dimension. It is standing right next to you. Invisible, starving, and desperate for a body. Where do demons actually come from? Not the Sunday school answer. Not the comfortable institutional version. The real one. The answer that was mainstream theology for the first 300 years of the Christian faith and then quietly, deliberately erased. Tonight, the Book of Enoch gives us that answer. And it is nothing like what you were told. To understand the full weight of what was hidden from us, you first have to understand who used to believe it. This was not a fringe theory. This was not the obsession of a desert cult. This was the official position of the earliest architects of the Christian faith. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century AD, one of the most respected early Christian apologists, a man whose writings were read across the known world. He stated it plainly, without apology. The pagan gods of the ancient world, Zeus, Apollo, Baal, Osiris, were not fictional characters. They were not literary metaphors for natural forces. They were real. They were demonic. But he didn't believe they were fallen angels. He believed they were something far more disturbing. He identified them as the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, the giants, the catastrophic offspring of the Watchers and human women. The same creatures described in graphic detail in the Book of Enoch. He wrote that these spirits denied access to heaven, denied rest in the earth, had presented themselves to ancient humanity as gods. They demanded worship because worship required offerings. Food, wine, incense, blood. And through those offerings, they experienced something they were perpetually denied. The sensation of a physical world they could no longer touch. This was not a minority opinion. For the first 300 years of the Church, This understanding was woven into the theological fabric of the faith. The Book of Enoch was read aloud in early Christian gatherings. The great minds of the early church, Origen, Tertullian, Irenaeus, all engaged seriously with its claims. The letter of Jude in the New Testament quoted it word for word. These were not reckless men. These were the people building the architecture of a religion that would reshape the world. So what changed? By the 4th and 5th centuries, something shifted. The church had grown from a persecuted movement into an institution. And institutions require order. They require a theology that is clean, coherent, and above all reassuring. The idea that invisible, cannibalistic spirits were wandering the earth hunting for human bodies to inhabit, feeding through whatever openings of violence and depravity they could find, was not clean. It was not reassuring. It made God look like he had failed to finish the job. If the flood was supposed to cleanse the earth, and the spirits of the giants were still here, still active, still capable of possession and destruction, then the great cosmic reset hadn't worked. The earth was still contaminated. We were still living inside the problem. That was too uncomfortable. So they changed the story. They decided the sons of God in Genesis were not supernatural beings, just men. The righteous line of Seth, the Watchers, became a metaphor. The Nephilim became exaggerated legends. The Book of Enoch was quietly set aside. Not banned with fire and fury. Just deprioritized. Not copied. Not cited. Not referenced. And when a text stops being copied, it disappears. Not with a dramatic burning. With silence. But what the Western Church chose to forget, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church never let go of. On the other side of the world, in the highlands of Ethiopia, monks continued to copy the Book of Enoch. To read it. To treat it as sacred scripture. They preserved what others chose to forget. And they preserved it because they understood something the Western Church was too afraid to accept. The truth about what we are sharing this world with. We need to go back. Before the water. Before the ark. Before the rainbow. To the moment the earth was first broken. The Book of Enoch chapter 6 opens with a world already deep into civilization. Humans had language, agriculture, trade, fire, music. They had built cities. They had developed legal codes and religious rituals. The human experiment was functioning. Then the Watchers descended. 200 of them. Immortal beings. Not metaphors. Not symbols. Specific, named individuals who made a specific, deliberate decision to cross a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. They came down onto Mount Hermon. And they came with gifts. Metallurgy, the working of iron and copper, the forging of weapons and tools. Astronomy, the reading of stars, the prediction of seasons and floods and harvests. The arts of beautification, pigments, ornamentation, cosmetics that still line the eyes of women across the ancient world today. And things darker than knowledge. Enchantments. The manipulation of hidden forces. the arts of war. But those gifts were the secondary crime. Their primary crime was biological. They took human women as wives. And those women gave birth to children that the ancient world had no framework to understand. The Nephilim. The Book of Enoch does not speak about them the way a mythology speaks of legendary heroes. It speaks about them the way a field report describes a catastrophe. They were enormous, beyond anything the human body could produce. Their appetite was beyond what the land could sustain. The text says they consumed all the acquisitions of men. Every harvest, every grain store, every herd of livestock that human hands had spent generations building. And then there was nothing left. When the food of men ran out, the Nephilim turned on the animals. Birds, cattle, reptiles, fish. The wildlife of the earth was consumed next. And when the animals were gone, they turned on the humans who had welcomed their fathers in. The same families who had made deals with the Watchers. The same communities who had traded proximity to power for safety. Those were the first ones consumed. They began to eat human flesh. They began to drink blood. Understand what is happening here. This is not mythology. The Book of Enoch is describing an ecological collapse. A biological catastrophe without precedent. The Watchers had introduced into the human biosphere a species with no natural predator, no biological limit on its growth, and an appetite that could never be filled. The earth could not contain them, and it could not stop them. The cries of the dying rose upward. The Book of Enoch records it with devastating specificity. The sound of the earth's suffering reached the gates of heaven. Not the whispered prayers of individual men. The collective scream of a world being consumed from within. The archangels Michael, Uriel, Raphael, Gabriel stood at the threshold and listened. And then they brought that sound before God. The response was the great flood. For thousands of years, we have been taught that the flood was a moral response. That God was grieved by human wickedness. That the earth had become so sinful that divine patience simply ran out. But the Book of Enoch offers a different frame entirely. Far more precise. Far more mechanical. Far more frightening. The flood was a sterilization protocol. The human genome was being systematically contaminated. If heaven did not act, there would be no unaltered humans left within a generation. There would only be hybrids. Apex predators wearing the shape of humanity. Consuming everything. Without limit. Without law. Without consequence. The flood was not anger. It was surgery. A desperate planetary reset designed to cut out a contamination before it became irreversible. The waters came. Rising from below the earth. Falling from above the sky. The mountains were swallowed. Every valley became an ocean. Every plain became a bottomless grave. The Nephilim fought. Of course they did. These were beings of enormous physical power. But water is patient in a way that strength is not. One by one, their massive bodies gave out. Their lungs could not hold against the weight of an ocean. They drowned. their huge bodies sinking slowly into the cold, dark mud. Heaven had won. Or so it seemed. Because the Nephilim were not only flesh. Half of their nature came from the Watchers. Half of their nature was spirit. Immortal. Indestructible. Not subject to the laws of water and gravity and biological decay. And that half did not drown. Stop. What happens next is the most important, most misunderstood moment in the entire Book of Enoch. And almost no one talks about it. God needed to deliver a sentence to the imprisoned Watchers. These were cosmic beings. Beings who had stood in the presence of the divine. Beings of terrifying power, now chained in the darkness of a place called Dudale. A barren, lightless wasteland beneath the earth. A void. You would expect God to send an archangel. Michael the commander. Gabriel the messenger. Raphael the healer. Any one of the great celestial beings who had remained faithful would have been the logical choice. Instead, God sent Enoch. A man. A mortal, aging human man. Flesh and bone. Walking into the dark. Alone. Think about the psychology of this decision. The Watchers had abandoned their divine station because they wanted proximity to the physical world. They wanted human women. Human sensation. Human experience. They had sacrificed their place in heaven for access to what Enoch was made of. And now, the thing they had destroyed their eternity for, was sent to deliver their doom. A mortal man. Reading them their sentence. In the dark. This is the Enoch paradox. The beings they had used and consumed and corrupted were now the vessel through which divine judgment was delivered. The last face they would ever see. The last voice they would ever hear. The face and voice of the very species they had broken. Picture Enoch walking into the abyss. Not a warrior. Not a supernatural being. A man. Weathered. Old. Perhaps. Carrying only the words he had been given to speak. The darkness around him would have been absolute. Not the darkness of a night sky. The darkness of a place that has never once known light. The cold would have been a living thing pressing against him from every direction. The silence, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the distant, inhuman sounds of chained immortals shifting in their bonds. And then he would have seen them. Not all at once. First, perhaps, the glow. 200 pairs of eyes. Amber and gold. Eyes that had once looked down from the heights of heaven,
to the depths of the earth,
now looking up from the
bound in
pit.
chains for 70
Enoch stood
generations.
before them. And he read. The words come from chapter 15 of the Book of Enoch. God speaks through this fragile mortal man. And the verdict has two parts. The first part is for the Watchers themselves. You were formerly spiritual, living the eternal life, and immortal for all generations of the world. And therefore I have not appointed wives for you. For as for the spiritual ones of heaven, in heaven is their dwelling. You knew. That is the crushing weight buried in those words. You knew what you were. You knew what you were for. You knew exactly where you belonged. And you left anyway. the sentence for the watchers, bound beneath the hills of the earth. Cut off from heaven. Cut off from the world they destroyed themselves to touch. For 70 generations. But then the verdict turns to their children. The dead giants. The Nephilim whose bodies lie rotting in the mud of the flood. And this is the part that should stop you cold. Because this is where the true horror of our present world is born.
The time is fulfilled.
The words of Enoch
Your
chapter
sentence is
15.
eternal.
But now the
Be bound
giants,
forever
who
within
are
the
born
abyss.
from the union of the spirits and the flesh, shall be called evil spirits upon the earth. And on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies. Because they are born from men, and from the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. Let that settle fully. The flood destroyed the bodies of the Nephilim. But their spirits born of the watchers, carrying immortal divine origin, did not cease to exist. They rose from their drowned corpses like smoke from extinguished fire. And they had nowhere to go. They could not ascend to heaven. Heaven belongs to beings of pure spirit. The Nephilim were contaminated by flesh. Hybrid. The gates were closed to them. They could not descend into the deep judgment that was reserved for the purely divine who had transgressed. The Nephilim were not pure enough for that verdict either. They were caught between, neither fully spiritual nor fully physical, neither heaven nor hell, just earth. This world, our world. The verdict continues, and the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against the women, because they have proceeded from them. They take no food, but they hunger. They drink no water, but they thirst. Imagine what that existence is like. They remember what it felt like to eat. They remember the sensation of flesh and blood and breath and warmth. They have the memory of physical existence permanently embedded in their spiritual nature. But they have no body, no hands to hold, no tongue to taste, no lungs to fill with air. Just the wanting, constant, infinite, unsatisfiable. This is the origin of the demons described across Scripture. Not fallen angels. Fallen angels are locked in chains in the abyss, the watchers themselves, awaiting final judgment. The demons, the unseen forces that hunt, possess, and torment the living, are the ghosts of the Nephilim. The hungry, disembodied remnants of a destroyed empire. Trapped on the earth they once ruled. Looking for any way back into the physical world. Looking for an opening. A crack. A vessel. And we are the only vessels available. Now look at the world around you. Look at the history of human behavior across every civilization, every century, every corner of the earth. Look at the wars that ignite without clear logic. Look at the epidemics of violence that sweep through communities without warning. Look at the way individuals sometimes seem to transform entirely, as though something else has moved into the body, and the person who lived there before is simply gone. We call this psychology. We call it sociology. We call it the human condition. The ancient world had a different word for it: possession. And here's what is anthropologically extraordinary. The concept of disembodied spirits attempting to inhabit human bodies appears in virtually every ancient culture on Earth. Independently. Without shared texts. Without communication across oceans. The Sumerians called them the Utaku. Invisible beings of terrifying hunger. Not gods. Not the dead. Something caught in between. Something that needed a living vessel to feel alive again. The ancient physicians of Mesopotamia wrote clinical descriptions of Utaku possession: the sudden personality shifts, the unnatural strength, the hatred of light and order that read almost identically to New Testament accounts of demonic activity written 2,000 years later. The ancient Egyptians documented spirits they called the wandering dead. Souls that could not pass on. Caught between worlds. Still craving the physical sensations of eating, breathing, feeling warmth. Their entire funerary system, the Book of the Dead, the preservation of the body through mummification, was designed as a barrier against these things. A way of ensuring the dead stayed dead, and the living stayed protected. In the shamanic traditions of Siberia, Mongolia, and the indigenous cultures of the Americas, the entire practice of shamanism was built around one fundamental reality. There are disembodied things in this world that want what you have. And a trained spiritual warrior is the only barrier between them and an ordinary human vessel. Every civilization, every continent, every century, the same warning, the same predator, different names for the same hunger. The Book of Enoch is the only ancient text that explains where this universal predator came from, and why it targets the living specifically, and why it has never stopped. When you understand the origin of the Nephilim spirits, the accounts of demonic possession in the New Testament suddenly read completely differently. Remember the Gadarene demoniac? A man living in the tombs, among the dead, cutting himself with stones. His strength so extraordinary that iron chains could not hold him. When confronted, the demons inside him spoke. And they said something that, if you understand the Book of Enoch, becomes the most illuminating moment in the entire New Testament. They begged not to be sent to the abyss. Think about that carefully. These are entities powerful enough to give a human being supernatural strength. Old enough to recognize a divine authority immediately. Ancient enough to know exactly what consequences awaited them. And their one request was not for forgiveness. Not for mercy in any traditional sense. It was simply this: do not send us into the void. Because the void means non-physical existence. It means that cold, dark, starving state of having no body. It was the only thing they feared. And then they made a second request. Send us into the pigs. Not into freedom. Not into the heavens. Into a herd of animals. Because even the body of a pig, a creature of no particular intelligence or beauty, was infinitely preferable to existing without a body. Any physical vessel. Any point of contact with the material world they had been violently expelled from. Anything rather than the void. This is the tragedy hidden inside the horror. The Nephilim are monsters. Yes. What they do is monstrous. The suffering they cause is real and devastating. But they are also, in a terrible way, victims. They were brought into existence by a decision they had no part in making. Their fathers descended. Their fathers chose to cross the boundary. Their fathers conceived them without asking what kind of world the children would inhabit, or what would become of them when that world ended. And now the children born neither fully in heaven nor fully on earth, destroyed in the flood before they could develop any capacity for wisdom or restraint, are sentenced to wander a world that fears and rejects them. Until the final judgment comes. They have no home. They have no rest. They have only hunger and the memory of what it felt like to be alive. And they are furious about it. The church buried this because it is terrifying on a very specific level. It is not terrifying the way a monster story is terrifying. It is terrifying the way a true diagnosis is terrifying. Because if this is real, then spiritual warfare is not abstract. It is not philosophical. It is not a metaphor for bad habits. It is an ecological reality. We are living inside a haunted battlefield, sharing the air in the cities and the corridors of power with the starving remnants of a destroyed empire. And here is the lesson the Book of Enoch has been trying to deliver for 3,000 years. We are the gatekeepers of the one thing they want most. A physical body. A vessel. A door into the material world. And that door does not open by force. The Nephilim spirits, for all their hunger and rage, cannot simply seize a human body against the full, conscious resistance of the person inside. They require an opening. They require alignment. When a human being gives themselves entirely over to unchecked appetite, to mindless consumption, to violence without consequence, to the complete subordination of conscience to physical desire, they begin to mirror the frequency of the Nephilim. This is exactly what the Watchers taught. This is precisely what was transferred when forbidden knowledge entered the world. Not the tools themselves. The philosophy embedded in the tools. Your body is the most important thing. What your appetite demands is the most urgent signal. Satisfy the hunger first. Ask the questions later. Or never ask them at all. Every time a human being chooses cruelty over compassion, they open a door a little wider. Every time a society chooses to arm itself before it builds wisdom, they are reconstructing the exact conditions of the antediluvian world. Every time an institution decides that the consumption of the few matters more than the survival of the many, they are not innovating. They are repeating. The flood washed away the giants' bodies. But we are the ones keeping their philosophy alive. We provide the vessels.
Together we can face
We
this.
provide the hands they use to strike.
With unity,
We
will
provide the
thrive.
voices they
Join
use
me
to
now.
justify violence. We provide the systems that replicate their logic of consumption without limit, without law, without consequence. The Book of Enoch is not describing a unique, one-time catastrophe. It is describing a recurring pattern. And it is warning us that the mechanism allowing the pattern to recur is not external. It is not some shadowy force we cannot control. It is a choice, made one at a time, by individuals, by communities, by civilizations. The same choice Samyaza made on the summit of Hermon. The same choice the 200 made when they stepped off the edge. The choice to let desire outweigh consequence. To let appetite write the law. We have done this before. We are doing it now. And the question the Book of Enoch has always been asking is whether we will recognize the pattern in time. The Book of Enoch was removed from the Western Bible. Not with fire. Not with a formal decree signed by emperors. With silence. With the simple decision to stop copying it. To stop reading it in the gatherings. To let it fade until its absence felt natural. Until the question of why it was absent felt irrelevant. Until the exclusion became its own justification. Because the men who built the institutions of power understood something important. If people read the Book of Enoch carefully, if they understood the true origin of what the ancient world called demons, the true nature of what walks beside us, they would start asking questions that no institution once asked. Not questions dangerous to God. Questions dangerous to the people who speak on God's behalf. If demons are the Nephilim spirits and not fallen angels in hell, then the geography of evil becomes far more complicated. Far more immediate. Far less manageable by institutional authority. If the earth is a quarantine zone and not a clean moral arena of good versus evil, then the map that powerful institutions use to navigate spiritual reality becomes dangerously unreliable. So they buried the text. And for 1,000 years, it worked. But the Ethiopian church kept reading. The Dead Sea Scrolls kept existing beneath the desert floor near Qumran. And the text itself refused to stay quiet. Because the thing about a truth that has been buried is that it does not disappear. It waits. Patient. In the dark. Like the things it describes. The flood failed to kill the real enemy. It only made them invisible. And they have been walking beside us ever since. Through every empire. Through every century. Through every moment when human appetite was offered power without wisdom. And said yes without hesitation. Watching. Waiting. Hungering. And in our own age, the age of systems built to maximize consumption without limit, of technologies handed to the world before the world had any moral framework to hold them, of covenants signed between brilliant people who cannot stop because too many have already sworn the oath. The question is the same as it has always been. Who are we letting in? And what door did we leave open to let them through? So tell me in the comments honestly, do you believe we are living in a spiritual quarantine zone? Sharing this earth with the ancient ghosts of the Nephilim? Or are the demons we face today just a metaphor for the darkness we generate entirely on our own? Are they outside of us? Or are they us? I want to know what you actually think. If you are ready to go deeper into the forbidden texts they tried to bury, subscribe. Because the secrets of our ancient world are still hiding in the dark. And there is much more still to uncover.